Thank you all for having me here this morning. It's such a beautiful congregation, a beautiful church, and it's so inspiring to know what you're doing in terms of creation care. Although I was born on the East Coast, I grew up mostly in Southern California, in Orange County. We had orange groves on two sides of our house, and I loved playing house there in the grove next door, where my sisters and I found some logs from eucalyptus trees that had been cut down. We arranged them on the ground into rooms and used the logs as chairs and tables. We gathered the acorns and put them in water into old metal coffee cans. Y'all remember the old metal coffee cans? Anyway, we let them sit for days, and the water became a black potion, useful for all sorts of culinary and medicinal purposes, at least in the imaginings of children. And later, going to high school, I'd walk about a mile through this same orange grove until it hit a road, and then I walked along that to school and back, and I can still smell the eucalyptus from those walks more than 50 years ago. So my relationship with nature is long and deep, and when I learned the word ecology in high school, it opened up another exciting way to understand the world. In high school, I also read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. It was a groundbreaking look at the negative impact of pesticides. While they had seemed to be a great invention a couple of decades before, it became clear the pesticides were harming not only insects, but also causing the eggshells of birds to be so brittle that the immature birds died. People began to recognize the unintended consequences behind some of our modern inventions. Another important part of my education about ecology was a year-long contemporary natural science course that I took at UC Berkeley. We started with physics, then chemistry, then biology, and by the end of the year, the class had touched on issues like nuclear weapons, overpopulation, soil degradation, and air and water pollution, all of the ways that we humans have been making a serious mess of our planet. 1970 was, of course, the year of the first Earth Day, and since then, I began carefully reading and following the news about environmental problems and their solutions. Like others, I was an early recycler and also started growing organic food in my home garden. I married and had my kids, and as an instructional aide in their school, I developed special classroom projects about waste reduction, avoiding pesticides, and energy-efficient transportation, like getting the kids to ride their bikes to school. We were delighted when our city of Palo Alto began the country's first municipal recycling program. And I began to see organic produce in our local grocery store as well. In 1987, I was hired as a program director at the Peninsula Conservation Center, a precursor to today's group called Acterra. Since then, my learning, and that of our nation and educated people around the world, has continued to grow. We now recognize that wetlands need to be preserved, that endangered species need protection, and that our planet has finite resources. And in the past 20 years, people have come to see that the most serious problem we face is climate change. If we don't stop emitting greenhouse gases, Earth's systems will no longer be able to absorb them. Tipping points will be reached that will shift weather patterns, disrupt the natural cycles between plants and pollinators, and cause wholesale population collapse of creatures that humans rely upon for our food, like fish. So, what am I working on now? Although I retired from paid work at Acterra 6 years ago, I'm still actively volunteering with several organizations, including Peninsula Interfaith Climate Action, in which your church member Rob Hogue is also active. He does the styrofoam recycling, you should probably know. I'm also involved with Fossil-Free Buildings of Silicon Valley, which is currently working to support a new regulation by the Bay Area Air District, which will ban the sale of new gas water heaters starting in January 2027, and new gas furnaces in 2029. And I also volunteer with 350 Palo Alto, which is working to support the Make Polluters Pay bill in Sacramento. It would require the largest fossil fuel companies to contribute to a statewide fund to help pay for climate-related disasters, such as wildfires and flooding. Such a Superfund law has already been passed in Vermont and New York State. And California and several other states that aim to require polluters to pay for repairing the damage are working to pass similar legislation this year. At the coffee hour table today, I'll have some sample letters that you might like to read, sign, and mail about the Superfund bill. We want to get it passed by next January. Before I close, however, I'd also like to invite you and join me in thinking a little bit outside the box of our attractive peninsula lives. I'd like to invite you to think about making the large expenditure that's required to stop using fossil fuels. Some of you may already have done this, and I really applaud you for doing that. If we are to believe the data that science and even our own senses is showing us, now is really the time to act. What can each of us do to reduce the carbon emissions that we are creating? About 40% comes from our vehicles, and I see many EVs in your parking lot. That's great. And another 40% comes from the fuels we burn in our homes, primarily methane gas. Isn't now the time to make this purchase and switch from gas to clean electricity? As you may have heard, California is now producing about 2/3 of its electricity from solar energy. And now it's already cheaper than energy produced by burning oil or gas. Often, of course, when we think about making a large expenditure, we may take a strictly rational approach and say, well, what is the payback time? Or will I be able to recap the investment if I sell the house? But there's another way to think about it, too. A friend of mine who was a utility engineer before he retired told me about a challenge that he and his wife were facing. They wanted to stop using fossil fuels in their older Menlo Park home, but they also knew that it would cut into their retirement funds and eat up the nest egg that they wanted their children to inherit. In some ways, it was a question of, well, should we bequeath them money or clean air to breathe? Well, after they chewed over this question for a while, they reached a decision. Rather than leave their children a larger sum of cash when they died, they decided to leave them an inheritance of fresh air and the model that they would offer others by switching away from gas. So I ask you to consider the question, too. What inheritance will you leave for your children and grandchildren? I'd be happy to talk with you about it at coffee hour, and thank you again for asking me to talk today.